So, welcome to today's webinar, APIs at the close of the digital decade and the future ahead. With us, Adrian and Joe here with SmartBear. So, your hosts for today, that is me on my left, Joseph Joyce. I'm a solutions engineer with SmartBear, and I am happy to be joined by Adrian Minnick. Adrian, say hello.
Hello, everybody.
So myself and Adrian work on the solutions engineering team at SmartBear, and that essentially means that we spend a lot of our time doing demos and troubleshooting calls and helping users of our tools and our platforms make the most out of them and get up to speed with them and all that kind of thing, which means that from an API point of view, we're having a lot of conversations with teams all the time about their API strategies and API testing and everything that goes with that. So a little bit of housekeeping, first of all. Like I said, the session is being recorded, so you will all receive a copy of that recording within the next day. Any questions at all that you have during the session? I can see a few people are using the chat box so far. If you have any questions that you would like us to try and answer while the session is going on, there's a Q&A box there as well in the Zoom user interface. So if you could post those types of questions there, it's just easier for us to keep track because we've got over 120 people joined so far, and it looks like that's growing. So it just helps us to keep track and make sure we can answer everything we can. If you want to hold on to your questions, we'll do a more open Q&A then at the end of the session. So who are we and why should you care? We are SmartBear. SmartBear, we are a provider of testing and development and monitoring tools, a whole host of tools that you can use at a variety of points in your SDLC. A couple of numbers there about our history and our offices and how many customers we have, how many users we have, all good stuff, all good numbers that are growing all the time. And a little bit of a shameless plug for SmartBear Connect. So SmartBear Connect is our customer conference that we'll be holding this year in the lovely Boston for April 27th and 28th. And the idea is that we bring together all types of users of our tools, so developers, testers, architects, BAs, project managers, everyone who is using SmartBear tools, and we can all share best practices and knowledge from the industry and from projects that we've been working on and all that good stuff. So we've been before. It's a really interesting couple of days for anybody who's using SmartBear tools and wants to learn a bit more. Plus Boston is it's a wonderful city, and it's a great excuse to go over. So there's a registration link there, and you can get 10% off with the code 10ATSBC. I've always wanted to say that. I feel like I am doing a podcast.
Yeah, and everyone loves a discount.
Everyone loves a discount, exactly. 10% off. Sure, why wouldn't you? So we'll get down to brass tacks. So the agenda for today, first of all, we are going to start to take a look at the growth of APIs in general, so the growth of the API market. Then we're going to take a look at some of the reasons or some of the drivers of that growth and the wide adoption of APIs. We're going to take a look at some of the predicted trends for APIs in 2020. And then we'll be taking a look at a demo of some of our API readiness tools, so some testing tools and design tools, and then we will wrap up with a Q&A. So like I said, if anybody does have any questions they want to hold on to till the end of the session, by all means do, and we will tackle them towards the end. So, like I said, myself and Adrian are working on the solutions engineering team at SmartBear, and that means that we spend a lot of our time talking to people who are very closely involved with developing APIs and testing APIs and maintaining them. And even just from those conversations and the volume of those conversations are growing, we're having more of them every day, and from that you could say that the API market is growing as well. They play a crucial role in digital transformation and innovation, and they do that by enabling platform and ecosystem business models and also agile business processes. So they are kind of like the connective tissue in today's modern software ecosystems. So, APIs themselves are not necessarily anything radically new. They've been used in software development in some form or another for the last couple of decades. But the last 10 years have really seen a massive spike in API adoption and growth. So you can see a couple of figures there. New APIs are constantly being added to the ecosystem, and these are just the ones that are can't track off there by the programmable web, which is a really good resource for kind of public APIs. So they're being added at a 30% increase over the last 4 years. And the API lifecycle market, according to Gartner, was worth 1.2 billion in 2018. And that is forecasted to grow quite a bit by 2023, up to 5.1 billion. It's quite a lot of money, quite a big market, and a lot of opportunities there, which would explain why we're talking to more and more teams who are going through some kind of digital transformation process that inevitably will involve their APIs or an API platform. So according to Gartner, the pulverization of the API economy into a growing number of sweeping digital transformations and the rise of the platform/ecosystem business model have put API programs on the agendas of CIOs and in some cases CEOs. And again, myself and Adrian we can confirm this isn't just a nice quote. Even maybe 2 or 3 years ago when I first started with SmartBear, conversations about API testing and API development, an API design maybe with Swagger Hub would have involved kind of more practitioner level users, so designers or developers or testers. But increasingly over the last year or so, we tend to see, I've seen a spike in conversations that involve like the likes of, a CIO or a CEO, or, the idea of a digital transformation that involves APIs is kind of going further up the chain, and kind of getting onto the agendas of more strategic decision makers in organizations, which is good to see. And this adoption is continuing to rise. So some of you might have joined. We ran a webinar last year about our State of API report. So this is a report that we ran over the course of 2019, where we basically we talked to a massive amount of basically all types of professions and practitioners who would be involved in API development at various different points. So again, from the tester, from the BA, right up to the CTO or the CIO, in terms of, what we wanted to do is to try and find out what the trends were with API design and development that we can expect to see over the next couple of years. And we can see that the adoption is continuing to rise. So 2/3 of organizations that we talk to have only started to develop APIs in the last 5 years. So even though this technology and APIs as a concept have been around for decades, as we said, 2/3 of the organizations that we talk to have only started to develop APIs over the last 5 years. So the 2019 State of API report saw a much higher percentage of early adopters than the 2016 State of API report, with twice as many respondents saying that they only began developing APIs in the last year. So again, this exponential growth in organizations who are starting to see, we should probably be working on our APIs and trying to monetize our APIs and trying to turn them into some kind of a platform instead of just having all these kind of monolithic services that we might only be using internally or for our own internal systems.
Yeah, and that was something I was just going to mention there, Joe, with regards the magic word of microservices. So we can see here on the chart that the majority, I think it's 60% or 2/3, have begun to adopt APIs over the last 3 to 5 years. But a lot of the people that we'd actually be speaking to at the moment, they would be moving from that whole monolithic to microservices approach.
Mm-hmm.
So
absolutely,
we'd have that adoption, and then also people that are using microservices at the moment, looking to mature their workflows and processes.
Absolutely. Like, if I had €1 for every time, the idea of, or the requirement of moving from monolithic to microservices comes up on conversations, I'd be a very rich solutions engineer. But no, you're absolutely right. So what is driving all of this growth, and why, digital transformation, no more than APIs, digital transformation is nothing new. The idea of an organization going through a digital transformation has been around for decades. But we have seen a growth in the number of teams that are coming to us saying that they're looking to kind of kick off a digital transformation process to kind of change the way that they do business. And there's, as we see it, there's three there's three big pillars that are driving API growth and driving the need to accelerate digital transformation. So as we see it, the three pillars of digital transformation are, first of all, with customer experience. So using a digital technology to understand relationships and correlations and how users are actually interacting with your services and the product you're providing or the services that you're providing. Then we have operational processes. So this would be kind of more from an internal point of view. So you're talking about things like process automation. Obviously, a big process that is frequently talked. We frequently talk about automating is test automation. So the idea that, we talk to a lot of teams who are probably up against it in terms of the number of people that they have on their team to actually test. Because their architecture is getting more complicated. The teams are kind of being spread out amongst different types of projects. So you want to make sure you're making the absolute best use of, a tester's time. Test automation can help with that, because obviously you want to make sure that you have your best testers free to do, exploratory testing, for example, right? So you want them to be able to focus on the processes or the features or the services or whatever your model dictates that are providing the most value or have the most potential. So that's what we talk about. We're talking about improving operational processes, right? So facilitating faster testing or better testing. And then the third pillar then is the business model, right? So this idea that even if the industry you're in, or a company that wasn't a software company or a tech company 10, 20, 30 years ago, pretty much every business, every company really is looking at themselves like a software company or a software business now and saying, well, how can we become more of a tech business or a software organization, right? Because how else are you going to compete effectively when pretty much every other organization is adopting something like that? So the idea of creating new digital sides of your business or coming up with new go-to-market strategies that are making effective use of the technologies that are there, because there's massive opportunities with the tech that's available. It's just a matter of seeing how can you use them to change or improve your go-to-market strategy. And that's going to open up pathways for innovation and growth. Everyone loves a bit of innovation, right, Adrian?
Yeah. Especially in tech. Yeah.
Exactly. It's everyone's favorite word. Yeah, that's it.
The buzzword.
That's it. And the span of digital touch points, it continues to increase. Enterprises are learning how to create engaging experiences at each specific point of interaction in the customer's journey, while also ensuring that the combination of all touch points results in a cohesive and compelling experience of the organization. So that's kind of at the front end. At the back end, then how that translate into the whole idea of monolithic services to microservices, right? Because if you want that to be the customer experience at the front end, then you need a kind of more fluid and a more agile back end to your business and your tech. So a couple of other things driving API growth, and especially in fintech. So again, as we said, these are trends that we're seeing on the macro level. But to talk about a specific industry, fintech and the financial services, even the word fintech, it's kind of, I don't know, I'd be interested to see when was the first time fintech was fintech coined. Maybe if someone with access to Wikipedia there can help me out in the chat. But yeah, fintech is a term we're all familiar with now, and it's kind of become an idea of a company or an organization in itself. But that's driving a massive amount of API growth as well. Trends like open banking, right? So I'm sure anybody who's working in fintech or anybody who's working in the financial services industry is familiar with open banking. The idea of opening up the industry and the kind of big players opening up their monolithic services and opening up their back-end services to startups, to fintechs, to kind of challenger banks, that type of a thing, and regulations like PSD2 that are heavily reliant on API. So one of the, we talk about pillars, one of the three pillars of PSD2 is an effective API platform. So that's been a huge driver of API growth as well. And mobile banking as well, so I think most people will probably say that they do most of their banking through an app now. And in the back end of that, obviously you have the front end, you have the mobile application side of things. But at the end of the day, for that app to effectively make use of the services that are connecting to your account and withdrawing money and depositing money, there's APIs involved there as well, right? So that's been a huge driver of API growth also.
Yeah, and I'm not sure about you, Joe, but I think I've about 3 banking apps now on my
well, look at you. Oh, to keep track of all that money.
Transfer money from account to account.
The money has just been resting in your account. Good problem to have. Too many bank accounts.
Not enough money.
And finally, another big driver, and kind of not necessarily I suppose kind of an industry in itself, or a subcategory in industry, is the idea of the IoT ecosystem, or the Internet of Things. So similarly to how he said there that if you're using a mobile app to do all of your banking, there is a very good chance that that app is using APIs to connect to the bank's microservices, right, to make use of that software. The same can be said for the growing number of smart devices. So again, you probably all noticed that people love putting the word smart in front of everything now. Smart cities, smart energy, smart shipping, that type of thing, which usually means that there's a lot of APIs being used to connect a lot of different hardware to each other. And APIs are a massive part of that because, REST API in particular, it's a pretty simple way to have two disparate devices communicate with each other over the internet. So that's been a huge driver of API growth as well. Again, to tie it back to the conversations that we're having all the time, I'd say second to fintechs that we talk to that are looking to adopt an API strategy. IoT type companies are another very common type of conversation that we have where they're going through some kind of digital transformation. And it's an interesting statistic there. The number of connected IoT devices will exceed 50 billion by 2022. So a growth rate of 140% over the next 4 years. So if that's 50 billion connected IoT devices, that's probably an exponential number behind that of API calls to different endpoints for them to actually communicate effectively. So huge driver of API growth.
Yeah,
Rakesh.
Yeah, yes. I was just about to mention Rakesh is on the ball.
Of the class. Apparently the first use of the word fintech way back in 1980. There you go, but it became a common term, widely used term starting from 2008. Rakesh, thank you so much. If there's anybody from marketing on the line, somebody get that man a t-shirt, get that man some merch.
Some swag.
Get him some swag. No, thank you, Rakesh. Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? Like it's kind of a lot of terms, even with like REST APIs and digital transformation, agile, all this stuff, you kind of hear them used as buzzwords and you would assume this must be something pretty new. But they're always coined much earlier than you would expect. So there you go, 1980. So that was a little bit about API growth. Let's take a look at what trends we are expecting to see drive API growth into 2020. So sticking with the kind of pillar analogy, the three components or the three big API trends that we saw, that we kind of infer from our state of the API report, and we're kind of saying these are the things that we identified as being important to the developer type users, right, who we talked to during the state of API report in 2019. So what would they like to see more of? What would they like to see done better in 2020 and beyond to improve their ability to write and deploy and manage APIs into 2020 and beyond. And the three components we identified were an improved developer experience, the enabling of intelligent standards, and seamless integrations. So starting at the start, improved developer experience. What do we mean by that? Adrian, I might get you to go into the next slide if that's all right. We'll jump into that report. Thank you. So the question we asked developers with regards to improved developer experience, we said, which of the following factors are most important to you when evaluating API tools? And what we found was API providers and developers want tools that are easy to use, implement, they support collaboration, and that fit into their existing ecosystem. So you don't, you want a very gentle learning curve so that it's going to be easy for you to adopt the tool. Nobody likes wasting time trawling through YouTube videos and trying to learn how to use a tool. In an ideal scenario, myself and Adrian would be out of the job, and it would just be a case of here are the tools. This is how you use them. Off you go. And we're getting there. But thankfully people still like talking to us, so that's good. But as we all know, we're all users of software in some form or another, professionally or in our personal lives. So the ideal thing is you don't want to waste time going through manuals and going through, trying to figure out how to do things. But the top there was ease of use, and whether whether you're a developer of APIs or a consumer of APIs, or the developer experience is hugely important, right? Because if you're an organization that is building an API platform or trying to add a big API component to your business model, the developer experience is huge, because the developer, whether it's your internal developers or external developers that you want to integrate with your platform, they become the kind of now the most important customer, right? Because if you're going to invest all this time in building an API platform and trying to, make it easy for other developers to integrate with your services, then you have to put the developer's experience front of mind, right? So that means, good documentation. That means, your APIs are easy to use, it's easy to collaborate on them, all that type of thing. So if you are looking at this, if anybody listening is kind of at the start of this journey and, they're thinking about what their API digital transformation process might look like, developer experience is front and center. So to kind of tie that into, we're kind of coming towards the end of the slides, so we might as well start talking a little bit about, the SmartBear tools that enable what we're talking about here. So that green logo in the middle of the screen there, that refers to Swagger Hub. So Swagger Hub is SmartBear's API design and collaboration platform for REST APIs. And it essentially does all of what you see here on the slide. So the idea is that if you're on a team or if you're part of an organization that are building an API development platform, and you want a place to collaborate on the design of a REST API, then Swagger Hub could potentially be useful, because it provides you a kind of a centralized location for the design of an API, for development, for kind of prompting development and testing, and hosting your documentation as well. And we're going to take a closer look at Swagger Hub once we're through the slides here. But the idea is that something like Swagger Hub can help you ensure that the APIs that you're developing result in a good developer experience for the people who are actually going to use them at the end of the day. So that's the developer experience. The other trend we identified as being important is standardization. And this again is specifically to do with API design and development. So which API technology challenges do you most hope to see solved in the near future? And I think there was an interesting kind of metric there at the top, is that in 2016, only 25% of people said standardization was important, and that jumped up to 58% in 2019. Standardization is the top API technology challenge that API teams want to see solved in the coming years. So what do we mean by that? Keeping in with the idea of, you want to be developing APIs and releasing APIs that developers actually, enjoy using, and it's not a headache for them to get up to speed with them and understand how they work and how to integrate them with the software that they're developing, right? Standardization is a huge part of that. So you want to make sure that if you're a large organization and you maybe have 10 different teams working on 50 different APIs, you want to make sure that API 1 doesn't behave in a way that's completely different to API 2 and API 3 and so on and so forth. So that's what we mean by standardization. And there's certain practical steps that you can take to ensure standardization. Conveniently enough, Swagger Hub is one way to approach that, right? So the idea with Swagger Hub is that you would want to be able to enforce design rules from the top down. And what we mean by that is, if I maybe take one or two steps back, if you think about developing a new API or adding new functionality to an existing API, right? And this might be an interesting one, even just to put to the audience, and ask the audience. So if you're working on an API team at the moment, when a new API is needed, or when a change to functionality of an existing API is needed, what's the first thing to happen? Is it code first or design first, right? So is the first thing that happens, the business requirement comes in and the developers start working away on implementing what the new functionality is? Or do you refer to some kind of design of the API, so a blueprint or an open API definition or a WSDL or WADL file, whatever format that design takes? Because that's, anyone who's familiar with SmartBear, familiar with Swagger Hub, if you've used the tool before, seen a demo of the tool before, we talk a lot about the differences between code first and design first and the pros and cons of both. But the idea with design first is that a business requirement comes in for a new API or a change to API's functionality. So, a developer gets a Jira ticket that says, hey, we're going to need to add a new endpoint here. instead of them jumping into their IDE and building that endpoint, the first thing that they would do is they would open up Swagger Hub and they would make a change to the Open API definition, which is just a JSON or YAML file for that endpoint. So they would add the endpoint kind of at the design level first, collaborate on that. They might make the change. They'll leave a comment and say, hey, Adrian, what do you think of this endpoint? And that's where that kind of feedback cycle happens. So the idea is that you're, amongst other things, you're potentially catching issues early on. So you catch them at the design phase. It's going to be easier for you to fix a couple of lines of YAML than it is for you to fix, a couple of hundred lines of Java code or whatever your implementation language is. That's what we mean by design first, right? And another thing that can happen at the design phase is standardization. And the idea with that is that, there might be certain rules or there might be certain things that you want to always be assured are going to happen or be built into your APIs, right? So you might want to say that, just to take a simple example of a standardization rule, that if a new API request or a new API operation is added, that each operation always has a default response, so that no matter what type of input comes in, there's always a default response that will come back. So that, I think we could all agree that's pretty sensible. That's a good practice. That's something that you might want to build into all of your APIs. But if you're at scale, so if you're going through digital transformation and you are building a large, API platform which involves multiple teams and multiple endpoints and multiple APIs, you might not want to necessarily leave that up to the discretion of every designer or developer to ensure that that's implemented, right? So Swagger Hub lets you essentially tick a box, you turn on a rule, and that rule says, all of my APIs, every operation must have a default response. So if you have 50 APIs stored in Swagger Hub, you can be assured that because you turned on that standardization rule, I know that all of these operations are always going to have a default response. And that rolls down to the developer experience, right? So if you're a developer and a developer is using SmartBear's APIs or a bank's APIs or some tech company's APIs, and it might be frustrating experience to say that, oh well, their login API had a default response, but their withdraw funds API did not have a default response. So what's the story here? Why aren't they behaving the same way? That's what we mean by standardization, right? And that's it kind of sounds pretty simple when you put it like that, but you can see how if it's not implemented, or if you have an API platform that has 20 APIs that are behaving in very different ways, how that could become frustrating for the developer, for the end user. So I hope that makes things a little bit clearer as to what we're talking about when we talk about standardization.
Exactly, and even at some of the conferences that we would attend, standardization is something that's coming up conference after conference. Mm-hmm. It's becoming, as you were saying, Joe, it's becoming extremely popular and something that a lot of organizations now want to implement as part of their workflow.
Absolutely. Did we get a few?
So we could see some of the comments there that were coming through were design first.
Very good. Yeah. I mean, like I said, there's pros and cons. And like if you're working on a small team or you're trying to get features out quickly, you're trying to get stuff out as fast as possible. Obviously, code first has its advantages, but what we generally see is in certain industries, like particularly in fintech, design first is preferable, because you want to be able to, it's kind of lower risk and lower effort to have your collaboration conversations in the early stage of the life cycle, and to kind of butt heads and decide on what the actual functionality is supposed to be then once something is implemented. So the final trend that so I can just see there's a couple of requests coming in asking about the recording of the session and saying that some people are having some connection issues. So like I said, have no fear. The session is being recorded, and we're going to send the slides and the recording out to all of you once it's done. So if you're having connection issues, don't worry about it. The final component, or the final trend that we identified from the survey for 2020, we asked the respondents to the survey, what tools do you use to develop high quality APIs? So what we found was that API providers are using an average of 5 different tools to develop high quality APIs. So I've been harping on about Swagger Hub a little bit, but one thing that I would always try and stress is that what you'll probably find if you're an API provider is no one tool is going to be a silver bullet for all of your API delivery and management and gateway and deployment and design needs, right? Very rare that you're going to have one tool that does it all. And we found that in the report, we found that in the survey as well, right? So that most providers are using an average of 5 different tools to develop high quality APIs. And you can infer from that then that an important aspect of any API design tool or any API development tool is going to be the ability for it to plug into to other tools in that ecosystem, right? So you're never going to have one standalone tool sitting in your environments and that just does it all. So what we tried to do with Swagger Hub is integrate it with other tools that are going to be important in your API development lifecycle. Which you see on the slide here, you can see a couple of native integrations. So Swagger Hub plugs into gateways and management platforms. It also plugs into a few different SCMs. So Swagger Hub has a code gen feature that lets you generate server-side code and client-side code for the API that you've designed. So in a design-first approach, you spend a couple of days working on the design of the API. When everybody's happy with that, you push a button and you've generated boilerplate code for the server-side and client-side implementations of the API. You push that to a source control tool, and your developers can pull it and start actually building the functionality. Similarly, it plugs into a couple of different testing tools like SOAP UI Pro, which is SmartBear's API functional testing tool. So there's a good integration there, which we'll take a look at during the demo. And it's also pretty easy to plug it into a CI/CD pipeline as well. So like what we usually say with Swagger Hub is that an open API definition, which is what you're storing in and collaborating on in Swagger Hub, can potentially be quite useful throughout your lifecycle, right? So if your API design document is dynamic, if it's something that you can make use of, then we kind of feel like it can be pretty useful for prompting developers, prompting testers. You can use an open API definition as a config file for a gateway. It just means that the more time you spend in the design phase thinking about what the API is eventually going to do and behave like, Swagger Hub makes it pretty easy for it to become, something kind of dynamic and active in the lifecycle as opposed to just a static documentation of your API. And that is that in terms of our slides. So if anybody has any questions on that content so far, please feel free. Someone has asked, how does the QA part factor in? That's actually something we'll probably cover now during the demo, as we'll see how an open API definition can be used to create functional tests for your API. So we'll take a look at that now. And Adrian is going to bring us through a little bit of Swagger Hub and a little bit of Ready API.
Exactly, yeah. So as Joe mentioned, we'll be able to go through Swagger Hub. So take a look at designing our API definitions. Then from there, we can step through a workflow. So we can show you how different team members can collaborate on the design process, add in feedback. We can add in the design rules, which Joe mentioned, and also use domains as a way of standardization. And then we can use our API definition with our functional testing and service virtualization. So that will allow us to shift left and begin our testing at an earlier stage. So to begin, this is the screen we're currently on. So we're in the Swagger Hub tool at the moment, and we can see our catalog of APIs. So I can open up one of these API definitions. And then from here, we can see this is the main screen that our designers are going to be working on. So a designer, when using a code-first approach, they'd be able to build out their API definition here. And as they're building out their API definition in the code editor, we can see the documentation on the right-hand side will also be built out for us as well. So this removes the manual process that some organizations would have of having to generate the API definition here, so build out the code, and then separately generate the documentation. So within Swagger Hub, all of this will be done. The documentation will be generated as you start to build out your API definition. Now, we mentioned the collaboration aspect. So we might have one designer who's creating or building out our API definition, but we might also have a couple of team members that want to collaborate and provide feedback on this. So we can see here, we have the ability to add in comments and allow team members to collaborate. So we can select the plus icon, we can add in comments. So for instance, we can ask our designer to change method or update a method. We can leave that comment and we can see now a list of our open comments and resolved comments. And this comes back to, with the collaboration, rather than, let's say, different team members sending emails or using different messaging systems, all the collaboration can be done within the platform itself, so within Swagger Hub. So we can see designers, they can come in, they can resolve the comments, and they can update their definition here to reflect the collaborators' views. So at this stage, within the workflow, our developer or designer, they've built out their API definition, they've gone through the feedback loops, and now at this stage, they might want to, let's say, publish this and create a new version. So once again, this can be done here. And this was something that was mentioned. We didn't go into too much detail earlier on, but versioning was one of the areas for ease of use for developers. So being able to create multiple versions, just enter in a new version number here and publish that. So once we have our, let's say, API definition, we have gone through the feedback loop, we have new versions created, we can now add our standardization to this. So at the organization level, so just going to go back out here and I'm just going to show you the design rules, which Joe talked about earlier on in the demo. So with the standardization,
Mimic Inc.
Yeah, it's my new business venture.
Your little side hustle.
My side business. It's just getting up and running, but hopefully when it matures in a few years' time now,
you go public.
I'll go public and I'll be able to retire at an early age.
Yeah, buy the stocks now, folks.
Yeah, we can see here within the standardization in Swagger Hub, this allows us to add in design rules. So we have some predefined style rules here. So we can see I've one selected here, which basically states that within the API definitions stored in this organization, we want, or there must be an API title present, and it can't be empty. So it must contain a string. As we go down here, we can also see we have custom rules available as well. So this is new functionality which was recently added into Swagger Hub, as, let's say, a lot of the feedback we were, let's say, receiving from our customers and clients was that they liked the predefined style rules, but they also wanted the ability to add in their own custom rules. So from here, we can now see we have the ability to create our own style rules, and we can enter in, let's say, or build out rules for the existence of paths, and we can also use regex expressions as well to search for content throughout. We can define the severity of the rules, and we can test this out. So we can import a definition into Swagger Hub and test out our style rules. So they were two of the main things with regards ease of use for developers. So the ability to be able to collaborate, but also to add in standardization. So we know once we have these rules created and implemented for our organization, we now know these standards must be met. And if an API definition is created and it isn't meeting these standards, then it's going to bring up an error message and it's going to stop us from publishing the API definition. So just enters in a workflow and once again, just adds in that level of standardization into the design process. So we've had a look at how we can create and build out our API definitions. From here, once we have our API definition created, we might want to use that API definition, generate some code from it. So we can see here, in the code generation section. We can generate client SDKs, server stubs, documentation. So for instance, if you wanted to have some of your documentation hosted on a web page, you can generate this documentation here and have that implemented. And we can also use or generate and export JSON and YAML documentation. So this will be our API definition. And this is what we'd use to increase the efficiency of our testing and virtualization. So what I showed there was a manual export. So being able to manually export our API definitions or our code, but we can also have those integrated as part of our source control. Let's say if you wanted to have that integrated with your source control tools or API gateways, you can select your integrations here and you can have those, let's say, definitions or code, server stubs or client SDKs integrated and pushed to your source control or to your API gateways.
Yeah, I think that's like Mario's he's got one step ahead of us there, but you're right. Yeah, the idea is that I think in the most mature organizations that I've seen implement Swagger Hub, it's less that the generated code comes from that like manual export on the top right-hand side, but more what you showed there, Adrian, where they'll set up an integration with their SCM, and then that just happens whenever a new version of an API is saved or published, right? So it's not something you have to think about. If a new endpoint is added and a new version is created of an API, that will kick off the sync, push the new code to GitHub or wherever it's stored, and developer gets a notification and says, hey, there's a new endpoint to be added. Take a look at this, implement it. So yeah, this is kind of what we meant when we said that an open API definition really it's most useful as a dynamic kind of trigger for other downstream processes, right? Like code gen or testing, as we'll see now in a second.
Exactly, yes. And yeah, the manual export was just to give a flavor of the different code documentation and definitions that we can export. But yeah, let's say the majority of organizations would have that included as part of their source control or API gateway workflows. So I'm just going to bring us into Ready API now. So Ready API is our platform for API testing, virtualization, and load testing. So within this platform here, we can now generate our virtual APIs. So we mentioned our API definitions that we can create from Swagger Hub. We can now reuse those API definitions. So we can select create virtual service. This is going to allow us to generate a virtual API in Service V, one of the tools. I suppose just to take a step back, the Ready API platform that we're looking at now, this contains three main tools. So it contains SOAP UI Pro for our functional testing, Load UI Pro for our performance testing, and Service V Pro for our service virtualization. So we can see here, when we want to create a virtual API, we can use an API definition. So we can use the OAS definition that we created from Swagger Hub. We can also record traffic. So if you are currently integrating with third-party APIs, potentially you could record the traffic, build out a virtual API from that to reduce dependencies. And then we can manually build out our REST APIs as well. So I'm just going to create a virtual API from a definition. So this is a definition which I would have exported from Swagger Hub and I just have stored locally. So we can see this is a JSON file. And if anybody is familiar with Swagger Hub, this is just going to be for the pet store API. So within a couple of clicks here, we're able to create a new project or select an existing one. And then from here, it automatically builds out our virtual API from the information contained in our API definition, which we generated from Swagger Hub. Yeah, exactly. So this removes the manual process of having to create each virtual action. So we can see now we have our methods, we have our REST, our resource paths, and we have our responses. So from here, because we used our API definition, we don't have any logic built in at the moment. So we can add logic here. So we can change our dispatch style. So if we want to, let's say, update this for the pet ID operation, we can select parameter. We can add a default response. So we can choose whichever response we want, and we can add in some basic rules. So from here, we're just adding in some basic logic. So for instance, we can add in query parameters, path parameters, headers. So for this example, because we have a path parameter, I'm going to select path, enter in the parameter name, and enter in a value. So this basically means when we're creating these rules, if we enter in a value of 1 in our request for path parameter, then we're now going to receive the first response, response 1. And we can build out another rule very quickly just to say for the same parameter, if we enter in a value of 2 in our request, we're now going to receive the second response. For any other value that we enter in, we're going to receive our default response. We can also see at the top of the screen here, this virtual API, once we begin running it, is now going to be running under our local host under port 8088. So we've now created a virtual API using our API definition. We've also built out some logic behind it, and we've kicked that virtual API off. So we're now able to run tests against it. So the next area to look at is the generation of our functional tests.
Very good. The question just came in there from Petrus. Is SOAP UI considered as open API? So I suppose it's a good question. It's probably my fault for not going into maybe a small bit more context about what open API is before we kind of jumped in. But open API or the open API specification it's open source. It's a standard language agnostic interface, right? So you use it to define a standard language agnostic interface to a RESTful API, which allows both humans and computers to discover and understand the capabilities of the service. So it's basically like OAS is the grammar that you would use to write a document in JSON or YAML that describes the intended behavior of a RESTful API, right? And that's essentially it, right? So it's just, so OAS is the grammar. What you actually end up with is an open API definition that's written according to OAS, and that's a JSON or a YAML file. That's what's stored in Swagger Hub, right? So that's what you are, if you're in a design first workflow, an open API definition is obviously very useful. That's your design document, and that's written as per the open API specification, right? And that's what you use in SOAP UI Pro or in Ready API and Service V to generate your functional tests or to generate your virtual assets. So SOAP UI Pro is not the same thing as open API, but it uses open API. You can use open API files and open API definitions to create projects. So that's how those two relate to each other. But it's a good question. Its context is very important with these things.
Exactly. And the virtual API that I created was from an open API definition. But as we've seen, we can also use, let's say, WADL definitions and WSDL definitions for SOAP services.
We certainly can.
Okay, so from here, we've created our virtual API. This is now running. We can now build out our functional tests using our API definition as well. So we can see we have our Swagger Pet Store API definition stored. We can just click on this and very easily select Generate Test Suite. So this is automatically going to build out all of our test cases for us. So once again, just within a couple of clicks, we can open this up and we can now see a list of all of our test cases which were defined within our API definition in Swagger Hub. So if we want to look at the same test, we're now looking at the same resource path and method. So a get method for pet ID. And we can now see we have our endpoint, which is defined within our definition. So we can run our test against this endpoint. We will receive our response on the right-hand side. But we might want to run this against our virtual API. I suppose the fact that we created now during the demonstration, we may as well run it. So we can enter in, we can change our endpoint, and we can just point to the local host under port 8088. We can run our test here. We receive our response. Now I want to check to see, is this the correct response? So I'm going to update my response in service fee. Once again, we're very easily able to change all of the response data for our virtual APIs. So I'm going to enter in SmartBear 1. For my second response, I'm going to change this and enter in SmartBear 2. So now we should be able to confirm that we're running this against our virtual API and that we're receiving the correct responses. Perfect. So we can now see when we enter in the value 1 in our request and send it against the virtual API, we're now receiving the response, our correct response. If we enter in the value 2, we should receive SmartBear 2. And if we enter in any other value, we should receive an error message. So we can see 404 not found. So we can now verify that this is working correctly. Now, this is just one level to it. So we're just running a very basic manual test against it. But then within SOAP UI Pro, we can also add the layer of automation. So we can run data-driven tests. So we can pull in data from Excel spreadsheets or databases, loop through that request data and receive our responses. And we can also run this as part of our CI/CD process. So if we want to run nightly or weekly builds, we can very easily select our test case here, or test suite, launch test runner. And from here, once we add in the information, so reporting information, different environments, we'll be able to build out, SOAP UI Pro will automatically generate a command line argument for us that we can use in our CI tools. Now, once again, we've just barely touched on the functionality within SOAP UI Pro. So SOAP UI Pro, as we mentioned, allows you to data drive your tests, but you can also create multiple environments, generate your reports from your test cases, and you can have all of those included as part of your CI/CD process. So that is the demonstration on a workflow. So we've now showed how we can use our Swagger Hub to design and generate our API definitions. And then once we have our API definitions available, we can begin our testing. So we can virtualize an API and we can run our tests against that virtual API. And all of this can be done at the same time as we are beginning our development. So this allows us to shift left and begin our testing at the same time as our development is, as we begin our development.
Mm-hmm.
Perfect. So I suppose I just want to check, is there any questions at the moment, Joe, with regards to the tools themselves?
Yes, there sure is. So first of all, Senthil has asked, is Ready API free to use? So you can download a free trial, but Ready API itself, it's a commercial platform. It has 3 pretty powerful tools in there between SOAP UI Pro, Load UI Pro, and Service Fee Pro. So it is a paid tool. So it's free to use for your trial, after which you'll probably be thinking about buying a license for it. But I definitely recommend, look, if this looks like something that might be useful, you know, download a trial, you'll get it for a couple of days. You can test it out on some of your own endpoints and services. And if you want a further demo or if you want to talk about a POC or anything like that, absolutely get in touch. That's what me and Adrian do every day. Another question from Elisa. The responses defined in the virtual service come from where? Are they a small manually created database of sample responses? So in this example that Adrian went through, the responses come from the OpenAPI definition, right? So this is kind of like what I meant when I said that an OpenAPI definition can be like a dynamic resource for other parts of your testing lifecycle, right? So you can, if you, like Adrian, if you go to that GET request, oh yeah, there, sorry, forgive me, you're way ahead of me.
Way ahead of you, John.
There you go, no flies on you. Yeah, like I said, that operation has 3 samples there, a 200, a 400, and a 404. That's all described in the YAML, in the OpenAPI definition. So the more information that you put into your OpenAPI definition, the more time you're saving yourself further up further up the life cycle, right? So that's where they were coming from in that case. We want to automate the API test using Ready API. Is it possible? It is. Ready API has a lot of test automation capabilities, which we would be more than happy to go through on a demo, and it also does load testing as well. So Senthil, it sounds like you might benefit from kind of deeper dive into Ready API. So by all means, get in touch with us and we can set up a demo for you.
Yeah, there's also one question I can see here. I think it's come through the chat about how do we validate our API testing. Mm-hmm. So within SOAP UI Pro, we do have the ability to create assertions on our functional tests. So we can create assertions here. So if you want to validate specific content or the existence of fields, or if you wanted to only receive specific status codes, there's a large list of assertions that you can generate or validations within SOAP UI Pro. Now, I'm conscious of time at the moment, so we do have a poll which we can launch at the moment. So I'm just going to launch the poll. So with this poll, we can see it should be visible now. So it's, are you interested in learning more about SmartBear products shown? So we've had a look at 3 tools today: Swagger Hub, Service V for the virtualization, and SOAP UI Pro for the ability to generate and scale your functional testing. So brilliant, we can see there's good response at the moment.
Couple of quick fire round questions coming in there. What is the maximum concurrent users that we can use with Load UI Pro? That all depends. How much hardware do you have to dedicate to your load tests? Exactly. That's something that we would be happy to do a deep dive on in a Load UI Pro demo. But in a nutshell, there's no fixed limit. I suppose it depends on what type of license you have, and also then how much infrastructure, whether it's physical or virtual, you have to dedicate to your load tests. But in that sense, barring those 2 variables, there's no actual, kind of fixed limit that we impose. Can we do load testing with Ready API in AWS? Yes, you can. There's actually some pre-configured AWS load agents that you can use in Load UI Pro, so you don't even necessarily have to use your own infrastructure. We've provided some pre-built infrastructure you can use. That's AWS. Can we create test scripts automatically from a Swagger file? Yes, we absolutely can. That's what Adrian did in the demo. Advantages of great questions coming, guys. You have a few more minutes left. We'll try and get through as many as you can.
Yeah, we can see one about languages for functional testing. So within SOAP UI Pro, there's support for a large list of languages here. So you can see on the screen, we have SOAP, REST, HTTP, JDBC requests, JMS request, GraphQL. So there's a large list of languages supported there.
Mm-hmm. So guys, look, appreciate everybody answering the poll. Unfortunately, like I said, there's more than 100 people on the session, so we're not going to be able to get to every single question that's asked, but that's what we're here for after this demo, right? So if you have any more detailed questions, if you want to see something more specific about any of the tools that we looked at today, give us a call, get in touch with us over, if you go to smartbear.com, you're going to find there's a Drift chat. You can chat with one of our reps, chat with one of us, and we're happy to go into more of a deep dive on any of the topics. We appreciate all the questions, but unfortunately, we just don't have time for them all. Thanks for answering the poll. Got a pretty high response rate there, which is great. Again, the more feedback we get from you guys, the better. I suppose all that's left to say, and now that it is 11 a.m., is first of all, thank you all very much for joining. Look, we really appreciate it. Again, sorry we weren't able to get to every question, but like I said, I hope that what we were able to get through was very useful for all of you. And if anybody does want to see anything more detailed or a longer demo on any tools, absolutely give us a call. Adrian, thank you so much for joining me and helping out with the demo and the questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Joe.
And with that said then, thanks everyone, and we will talk to you soon. Have a lovely day.
Perfect. Thanks, everybody.